Hi guys, welcome to what is going to turn into another Wisdom Wednesday post. Today's podcast, or video if you will, is going to be on mobility for boxing and is inspired by Patreon subscriber Ryan O'Donnell's question as to hip mobility exercises for boxing and the implications that a lack of hip mobility can have on boxing performance. Now, even though Ryan specifically asked for exercises to do with the hip, what I'm going to be doing in the presentation today is discussing the implications of mobility restrictions, why boxers face the restrictions that they tend to face. I'm going to describe what impact this has on boxing performance, and at the end of the presentation I'm going to give a couple of solutions to these restrictions. Now, the first thing to note whenever we're talking about mobility, and it's a topic I've posted on quite a bit, that mobility training is a bit like Pandora's box. What I mean by that is not all mobility methods actually improve mobility longer term, which is ultimately what we're after, because if we keep having to do the same mobility exercises and we don't get any better, that's a bit rubbish. So there's different mobility methods. They have different outcomes. Some improve mobility in the long term, some improve it in the short term, and some can actually hinder performance, which I know sounds like a bit of a contradictory thing. So I'm going to try and keep it brief on the method side of things, as I've done other content which I will link up when this video goes live, but that is ultimately what we're going to be doing. Also, another thing before we get into this is that strength is going to have more of an impact on your performance than mobility. Now, if you're something like an Olympic weightlifter or you are a gymnast, then arguably flexibility is more important than what it is for boxing. But if you check out the work by, I believe it's Lawrence in 2014, their study showed that the impact of strength on injury risk far outweighed the impact of flexibility. Now, there's a difference between flexibility and mobility. Flexibility typically being passive, for example, could you sit in the splits, whereas mobility, there's a strength requirement to that, and that's more active. For example, could you jump up and end up in a almost split position with your legs, so you're actively taking your body through that range of motion rather than just sort of sitting there and relaxing into it. So it's a bit of a rabbit hole, but let's actually get into today's topic. So, as a former amateur boxer myself, and having been lucky enough to be part of the strength and conditioning team for GB Boxing's Rio 2016 pursuits, the common issues that boxers typically face, and this is something that I'm still dealing with now, to be fair, typically hips. You've got to think that if you're an orthodox boxer, then the left hip and the left shoulder, if I'm sort of seated in my stance, this obviously might appear opposite to you on the video, but typically this lead shoulder is going to be internally rotated, and sometimes you might even get used to almost it shrugging upwards. So this internal rotator, so your pecs, your traps, they're probably going to become overly dominant and they might start to tighten up. Equally, the muscles on the back of the shoulder, they're going to get weak and they may lengthen. So in comparison, the lead shoulder and lead hip, they are stuck, or they tend to spend large volumes of time in internal rotation, whereas the back hip and the back shoulder spend more time in external rotation. Now, if boxing was an overhead sport, then this would be not ideal, because we're going to need external rotation to go overhead. And in terms of the foot and ankle, boxers do a lot of road work, a lot of running work, and typically the calves tighten up because they're not really well looked after. Also, you've got to think when you're sparring, when you're shadow boxing, anytime you're sort of on the balls of your feet, you are, just by nature of repeating an activity so many times, your calves may start to experience some issues. So the primary issue is probably hips and shoulders. Secondary issue, but still important because of the running volumes boxers do, is going to be the foot and ankle. So what are the implications of these restrictions on boxing performance? Now, I put increased injury risk as a question mark because I'm just going to use tennis as an example. If you've got a left-handed player, that left side is going to be more dominant. Now, the reason why there's a question mark is an imbalance doesn't automatically mean there's going to be an increased chance of injury. What you tend to find is it will be a performance enhancer up to a certain level, and then if the imbalance gets too big, that's when we're going to start to encounter problems. Now, just as a personal anecdote, my left shoulder, so I was an orthodox boxer, my left shoulder or my overhead range is always limited, typically more limited on my left hand side, and typically even when I do bilateral work, so where both feet are on the floor, sometimes I'll feel, for example, more soreness or more that I've worked more on my left hand side, even if I've done double legged work. So I personally think that's because the left side almost doesn't feel as stable as it should, but that's a story for a different day. But if, for example, your body is not confident in the ranges you're putting it in, then it's going to reduce your power. Without going too scientific, whenever the body feels threatened, it's going to restrict range of motion and it's going to restrict force output because it doesn't want you to do any damage to yourself. And the main areas we're going to see, because as I said, there's differences in the rotational capacities of the hips and shoulders. So this is probably most likely going to impact the power or your ability to rotate when it comes to throwing a hook. So Battle of the Hookers, terrible headline for a show. Eddie Hearn's not going to call me anytime soon, but Povetkin and Dylan White as an example, if that imbalance got too big, then you might see that their ability to throw the hooks as venomously as they do may well be compromised. So what do we need to do about that? Also, as I said, if the calves aren't taken care of or we lose mobility at the foot and ankle, this is going to increase injury risk, not just at the ankle, but the knee probably, and sometimes even the lower back, because that force or the lack of mobility, they have to try and get mobility from another area. And sometimes these areas where they're trying to get mobility from, such as the knee, are actually designed to be more stable. So as I said, how do we remedy these restrictions? So the first thing to note is it's going to be impossible to eliminate these restrictions, and to a certain extent we don't actually want to do that, because at the end of the day, if you're a boxer, let's say for example you train, I don't know, 20 hours a week or whatever it is, you're not going to be able to correct that with 1 hour of strength and conditioning a week. But there are some clever exercise selections you can make to at least damage limitation, at least it could be some kind of damage limitation. So, and the second thing to say is mobility is not a tick box. I've seen boxers, athletes, whoever you want, just go through the warm-up, go through the motions, and it's like, right, when are we going to get to the performance enhancement stuff? Which is fair enough, and obviously more specific work is probably in most cases more likely to transfer more quickly, but it doesn't mean general work doesn't have its place. So what I mean by saying mobility isn't a tick box, if you're still doing the same warm-up, whether it's in the gym or in preparation for your boxing that you did, say, 2-3 years ago, your mobility probably hasn't progressed because you've not really tried to do more advanced mobility movements. The same way if you were lifting weights in a gym and you're still lifting the same weights that you were 3 years ago, you're probably making a mistake. And the reason for this is people don't realize how mobility exercises can progress. So as an example with the single leg work, you might start off with something like a split squat, and then when that gets easy as your warm-up, you elevate the back foot. So now you're going through a deeper range of motion. And the reason why single leg work is so important to boxers is because typically, just like any athletes that spend a lot of time on one side, you're going to probably have a stronger side or a side that feels more stable. What you've got to be careful of, and I'm going to try and demonstrate this and stay in shot, is if we are going to do split squats, and again, I can't show you the whole portion of my body, but that's fine. You've got to make sure that as an orthodox boxer, I'm probably, and it might not even be as obvious as this, my pelvis is probably going to want to naturally align me slightly similar to my orthodox stance. In order to stretch that back hip properly, we need to make sure, imagine there's headlights coming out of the hip, we need to make sure those headlights are coming forward, not slightly to the side, and we need to make sure that's the same on both sides. And again, there's probably, your brain's probably going to try and make life easier for you by keeping you in that misaligned stance. But where we're doing exercises to improve our mobility, if we do them out of alignment, then we're not going to get the whole benefits. Next point to mention is It's also single arm work wouldn't be a terrible idea. Again, making sure, for example, if we're pressing something overhead, we're making sure our body is not starting to rotate just because that's going to be what it wants to naturally do. And activating the external rotators. I mean, that sounds more fancy than what it actually is. All that's going to be is we're going to have some form of pulling work, and when we're doing that, we're going to make sure, for example, if I'm pulling something towards me, I'm going to make sure that my shoulders are back and down. So when you see boxers do chin-ups, because they're used to, for example, fighting in this kind of posture, as soon as they go to do a chin-up, they're going to be using their shoulders for earmuffs. We want shoulders back and down, and then as we pull ourselves up, we're almost trying to tuck our shoulder blades into our back pockets. And if we talk about optimizing warm-ups, if we're talking from a gym perspective, loaded mobility is great. That load might just be your body weight to start off with, but the benefits of loaded mobility compared to something like foam rolling is loaded mobility, providing we're doing it correctly, we're going to develop strength. We're telling the brain that actually it's okay for me to be in this position, don't freak out and restrict my mobility. And that strength is going to add to our injury risk reduction. Whereas just getting flexible for flexibility's sake or mobile for mobility's sake, that's going to go very quickly. I learned the hard way spending months foam rolling areas of my back and my pecs, and the next day I'd be straight back to where I started. So loaded mobility is great of the lower body, so split squats, lateral split squats. If you've got access to weight and you're doing it properly, then loaded lateral work is going to do wonders for lengthening the abductors, so the insides of our legs. And I'm currently working on what I call a locked and loaded mobility package, because you're going to load the mobility, and then by doing this you're going to lock it in, so you're going to actually find your mobility sticks around for longer. And what we're aiming for with this is that we don't have to do an extensive long warm-up just to hit certain positions. We should just have it, and that is a package that I am working on. So again, specific an example of what I've said. So firstly, if we are going to foam roll at all, we need to appreciate it's going to be short-term changes. However, key trigger points for boxers are going to be the piriformis. So that's it's the outer hip muscle, especially on the left-hand side if we are an orthodox boxer, because as I said, that left hip is stuck in external rotation. Subscapularis, so again, if you just take a cricket ball, tennis ball, whatever your tolerance is like, foam roll in and around the shoulders, stay off the bone, and you will come to some trigger points. Play around with some overhead motion, so you're laying either pressing the ball in between yourself and a wall, or if you can handle it, laying on the floor, just getting used to moving your shoulder. You will soon hit up on trigger points that I would describe them as it should be uncomfortable but not unbearable. If it's unbearable, you need to ease up. The intensity is a bit too much. So once we have temporarily increased the range of motion by applying pressure to these points, then we're going to use exercises which demand that mobility. So eagles or open books are a great example of developing that rotational ability, which, as I said, is what boxers typically get compromised in when they let the hips and shoulders get tight. Then we're going to look at some kind of crawling exercise as an example. This is going to force the shoulder to have to stabilize. Now, it's also important to note that if we're not assessing, we're guessing. So for example, worth the topic in itself, but my shoulders, if I just do a quick example here, so just as a mobility example, you can see that my right shoulder, so this arm here, is sitting a lot further back than my left shoulder. Now you could say, oh, well, it must be a mobility discrepancy. Now, if I was given a little bit of weight, I can stabilize much easier. So crawling exercises force you to stabilize. By adding a little bit of load, your shoulders actually it's kind of like the shoulders and the brain know where the shoulder is in time and space, whereas unloaded, sometimes actually it might not be a mobility issue, it's a stability issue. But again, topic for a different day. And finally, med ball throws. So once you've got that hip mobility, once you've got that shoulder mobility, even if you've got it from short-term effects, such as foam rolling and the dynamic stretching, then we can start to use it. So if we don't use it, we lose it. And as I said, we end up right back where we started. So in summary, we're going to target any trigger points we have for a short-term relief, 20 seconds, no more, otherwise you're wasting time and it's only a short-term effect. We're going to use that range of motion, for example, using an eagle exercise or an open book, look them up. We are going to switch on any muscles which might have been a bit sleepy or a bit dormant. So in boxers, it's going to be the external rotators, aka the back or the glutes. And then we're going to integrate this into some kind of movement involving the whole body. And as I said, there'll be more on this coming in my locked and loaded package. That's it. So key take homes, make sure that you are progressing your mobility work over time. So for example, if you're actively moving through a range of motion, can you make that range of motion bigger? So split squats, you could go to a rear for elevated split squat. If you're doing something like goblet squats, so with the weight against your chest, you could stand on 2 steps and almost drop between those 2 steps. Secondly, make sure that you are paying attention to how you are performing the exercises, because if you're used to your boxing stance obviously aligning you like this, then when it comes to doing your single leg work, you still do it aligned like this, then effectively you're feeding what could be causing you an issue. So make sure, for example, headlights pointing forward, so we are in the right positions when we're performing our loaded mobility drills. Realistically, if you're optimizing your warm-up and you're training, for example, let's say you train 6 times a week or whatever it is, the warm-up is a key part of that. Make sure it's planned, make sure it's specific to you and your restrictions, and make sure you're progressing it over time. Thanks very much, guys. I will catch you again in the next episode. And if you have any questions for me or you just want to reach out to me, then my details are on the screen. Thank you very much for listening, guys.